Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. My YouTube channel is Discerning What is True, and tonight's talk is going to be on Tavistock Institute on Human Relations. And we're going to begin at the beginning. And I did a brief video actually a couple weeks ago, maybe a little longer than that relates to this, but it was not actually the book that was written by John Coleman. So I thought I would share with this tonight. I believed it would be worthwhile for people to try to find the book. Although, to be honest with you, I've actually tried to get a couple times the book, and they are out of reach because people are bidding on it. A couple books have been over. Well, one was recently actually about 145 bucks, and the other one was over 250 bucks. And if you look on eBay, there are books there to be sold, but I think the cheapest price without a bidding is $450. Some are over almost $1,000. So someone is trying to prevent you from getting this book. So I will be reading actually a PDF copy of this book, and you can get that on PDF Drive, D-R-I-V-E, and look for the book. It costs you nothing. It's a time, and we'll find out more experience about truth. So we're going to begin the reading now. Again, this is important that this is a work that was done by Mr. Coleman. Mr. Coleman actually at one time worked for the Tavistock Institute. And the whole idea is that the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations is to deal with what we call shaping the moral, spiritual, cultural, political, and economic decline of the United States of America. And Dr. Coleman has done extensive research in this whole deal. So we're going to start here and hope you enjoy it. I will try to answer some of your questions. Again, like I said, this is a pertinent book. If you can, again, like I said, you can get a PDF, fine, read it. There's Communitarianism is another book that you'll probably need to get an ebook on also. But anyway, here we go. In the foreword, it says, the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations was unknown to the people of the United States before Dr. Coleman exposed its existence in his monogram, the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, Britain's control of the United States. Well, Britain has actually been controlling this country for a long time. They've been trying to do that for a while, too. Up to that time, Tavistock has successfully retained a secret role in shaping the affairs of the United States, its government, and its people since its early beginnings in London in 1913 at Wellington House. Since Dr. Coleman's original article exposed this ultra-secret organization, others have come forward with claims of authorship which they were unable to substantiate. Tavistock began as a propaganda creating and disseminating organization centered at Wellington House, which was where the original organization was put together, with the intent of shaping the propaganda outlet that would break down the stiff public resistance being encountered to the looming war between Britain and Germany. The project was given to Lords Rockmere and Northcliffe, and their mandate was to produce an organization capable of manipulating public opinion and directing that manufactured opinion down the desired pathway to support for a declaration of war by Great Britain against Germany. And it's important that you understand this, folks, that the political poles are also a part of this. That's my jest in this, to sharing with you. And I, as a political science major in college, we did do polls ourselves. So let's continue. Funding was provided by the British royal family and later by the Rothschilds, to whom Lord Northcliffe was related through marriage. Arnold Toynbee was selected as Director of Future Studies. Two Americans, Walter Lippmann and Edward Menezes, were appointed to handle the manipulation of American public opinion in preparation for the entry of the United States into World War I and to brief and direct President Woodrow Wilson. These are high, important people. Both these guys, these Americans, are important. It'd be worthwhile for you to both to actually read some of their works. Edward Bernays would be propaganda. And Walter Lippmann was involved with the newspaper business for quite a while. And he is someone else you need to look into. From a somewhat cruel beginning at Wellington House, grew an organization that was to shape the destiny of Germany, Britain, and more especially the United States in a manner that became a highly sophisticated organization to manipulate and create public opinion, what is commonly called mass brainwashing. During the course of its evolvement, Tavistock expanded in its size and ambition. When in 1937 a decision was made to use the German author Oswald Spinneger's monumental work called The Decline of Western Civilization as a model. Previously, the Wellington House board members Rockmere, Norcliffe, Lippmann, and Bernays had read and proposed as a guide the writings of, I'm going to spell it too because I don't know how to pronounce it, Correa, C-O-R-R-E-A, Malang, Walsh, in particular the book The Climax of Civilization in 1917, as corresponding closely to the conditions that had to be created before a new world order in a one world government could be ushered in. See, this has been going on for quite a while, folks. The whole idea of the New World Order. It's not because simply George Bush spoke it back in the late 1980s. It's been going on far longer than that. In this endeavor, the members of the board consulted with the British royal family and attained the approval of the Olympians. The Olympians is another group that's actually a part of the inner core of the Committee of 300 to formulate a strategy. Funding was provided by the monarchy, the Rothschilds, the Milner Group, and the Rockefeller Family Trust. Now, this book, this is not the only book that Mr. Coleman has written. He's written a book called The Committee of 300. So you might want to look into that also. In 1936, Spinnaker's monumental work had come to the attention of what has become the Tavistock Institute in preparation for changing and reshaping public opinion for the second time in less than 12 years by unanimously consent of the board. Spinnaker's massive book was adopted as the blueprint for a new working model to bring about the decline and fall of Western civilization necessary to create and establish a new world order inside a one world government. Spinnaker held it bound to happen that alien elements would be introduced in Western civilization in increasing numbers, and that West would fail, at that time to expel the aliens, thereby sealing its fate, a society which inward beliefs and sound convictions would become at variance with its outward profession, and thus Western civilization would fall by the wayside in the manner of the ancient civilizations such as Greece and Rome. Tavistock thinking was that Spinnaker had indoctrinated Western civilization to believe that it would err on the side of the Roman civilization and expel the aliens. The genetic loss that has fallen upon Europe, and especially on the Scandinavian countries, England, Germany, France, that is the Anglo-Saxons, the Nordic, Alpine, and Germanic races that began just before the Second World War, is already so great as to be beyond expectations and continue at an alarming pace under the skilled guidance of the Tavistock managers. What was a very rare instance became a common occurrence, that is, a black man married to a white woman or vice versa. The two world wars cost the German nation almost 1/4 of its population. Most of the intellectual energies of the German nation were diverted into war channels in defense of the fatherland at the expense of science, art, literature, music, and cultural and spiritual and moral advancement of the nation. The same could be said of the British nation also. The blaze kindled by the British under the direction of Tavistock set all of Europe on fire and did incalculably damage according to Tavistock blueprint that matched Spinnaker's predictions. Now, what I've heard is that in the past was that Britain is involved with this both times. Now, and it's not just because of the whole issue of Tavistock, but the idea simply is that it felt threatened. It felt threatened economically. Germany was a up-and-coming country and was producing products that was competing with the British products. And this was a way to basically eliminate that competition. And so this is a thinking of my own, but it's not only that, it's been, I call a theory of what has been taught before, that Britain was interested in actually trying to decimate Germany. Germany was a country that was basically economically superior in many ways already in certain areas that Britain was not. So they felt threatened, you see. But they had to get other countries in order to do the fighting for them. Classical and Western are the only two civilizations that could bring a modern renaissance to the world. They had flourished and progressed just as long as these civilizations remained under the control of the Anglo-Saxon, Nordic, Alpine, Germanic races. The unsurpassed beauty of their literature, art, their classics, spiritual and moral advancements of the female sex with a very large corresponding degree of protection was what distinguished Western classical civilization from others. The key thing here simply is that the German race and their perspective of the female sex was to lift her up. This is something that was foreign to other countries. They realized basically that with women, it's important to protect her and to lift her up on a pedestal, because she is also not only one who actually has children, but is also pretty much in a lot of ways more spiritual sometimes than the men are. Continue on. It was this vastness Spinnaker saw coming under increasing attack, and the thinking that Tavistock ran on parallel tracks, but with a total different goal. I think I just read that. No, yeah, I did read that. Okay. No, I did not. Tavistock saw the civilization as a stumbling block to ushering a new world order, as the emphasis on protection and elevation of the female sex to a place of high respect and honor. Thus, the whole thrust of Tavistock was to democratize the West by attack on womanhood and the racial, moral, spiritual, and religious foundation upon which Western civilization rested. As Spinnaker suggested, the Greeks and Romans were devoted to the social, religious, moral, and spiritual advancement and the preservation of womanhood. And they were successful for just as long as they were in control and could arrange matters so that the government was carried out by a limited number of responsible citizens supported by the general populace below them, all being of the same pure, unadulterated race. The planners of Tavistock saw that the way to upset the balance of Western civilization was to force unwelcome changes in the race by removing controls from the deserving to the undeserving. In the manner of ancient Roman leaders. And who were supplanted by their former slaves and aliens whom they had permitted to come and dwell among them. Let's say that again. Who were supplanted by their former slaves and aliens whom they had permitted to come and dwell among them. That's a key target there, folks, because it realizes that if you understand the civilizations that have been destroyed in the last 3,500 years, a particular group has been involved in destroying all the Western civilizations, with the Babylonian, the Egyptian, the Persian, the Greek, and the Roman, all on purpose. Okay? And they were called in Egypt hyssops. Do some research on that. You might find out some more details. Tavistock by 1937 had come a long way from its Wellington House beginnings and successful propaganda campaign that had turned to the British public from being strongly anti-war in 1913 to willing participants through the arts of manipulation with the willing cooperation of news communication media. The technique was carried across the Atlantic in 1916 to manipulate the American people to support of the war in Europe, in spite of the fact that the vast majority, including at least 50 U.S. senators, were adamantly opposed to the U.S. getting dragged into what they perceived was essentially a quarrel between Britain and France on the one hand and Germany on the other. Largely over trade and economics, the conspirators were undeterred. At that point, Wellington House introduced the word isolationism as a derogative description of those Americans who opposed U.S. participation in the war. The use of such words and phrases had proliferated under the expert brainwashing of the social scientists at Tavistock. Teams like regime change, collateral damage became almost new English language. Yes, yes, it's another word that they use. If you remember Mr. Bush, his comments when the first war that took place with the United States in the late 80s was that they used that the regime in Iraq, that the people there were half human or subhuman. Again, these are key words that make people think something. This is similar to that. Okay? They do this on purpose, folks. It's just little niche words that get people, they don't realize it, and then they introduce the whole idea. If you remember that this girl came into the Senate building and spoke and said that they were doing something to the baby, such and such, and they were, quote unquote, half human or subhuman. That's what they usually do, folks. They have to bait you to get you involved in a stupid war that benefits themselves, not you. With the Tavistock Plan modified to suit American conditions, Bernays and Lipperman led President Woodrow Wilson to set up the very first Tavistock methodology technique for polling, is manufacturing. So-called public opinion created by Tavistock propaganda. They also taught Wilson to set up a secret body of managers to run the war effort and a body of advisors to assist the president in his decision making. This was called the Creel Commission. CREEL was the first such body of opinion makers set up in the United States. Woodrow Wilson was the first American president to publicly proclaim himself in favor of a socialist New World Order inside of a socialist one world government. His remarkable acceptance of the New World Order is found in his book called The New Freedom. We say his book, but actually it was written by a socialist, William B. Hague, Hayle. Wilson denounced capitalism. Did you know this? Did you really know this? It is contrary to common man and has brought stagnation to our economy, Wilson wrote. No, it has nothing to do with that, Mr. Wilson. Again, I tell you, as I've done before, I've done a couple of videos on Woodrow Wilson. He's by far the worst president of this country, by far, because he's the one that started a lot of this stuff. Look at what happened during his time in the office. Well documented. Yet at the time, the United States economy was enjoying prosperity and industrial expansion that he had never experienced before in its history. We stand in the presence of a revolution, not a bloody revolution. America is not giving to spilling blood, but a silent revolution whereby America will insist upon recovering to practice those ideals which she has always professed, upon securing a government devoted to the general and not the special interests. We are upon the threshold of a time when the systematic life of the country will be sustained or at least supplemented at every point by government activity. And now we have to determine what kind of a government activity it shall be, whether in the first place it shall be directed from government itself, or whether it shall be indirect through instrumentalities which have already constituted themselves and which stand ready to supersede government. Interesting. While the U.S. was still a neutral power under the Wilson administration, Wellington House poured out a canvas of lies about Germany and what a threat it was to America. How can Germany be a threat to America, folks? Give me a break. You know, there's not even they militarily, they're not a threat because they can't even fly their planes here, and they don't have a navy. The navy is pretty much based upon the submarines. They don't have a truly navy, as even the United States had at that time. It's a joke. But again, they use these things, okay? We are reminded of the statement made by Bakunin, spelled Bakunin, in 1814, as he tied in so well with the outrageous propaganda that Wilson made use of to bolster his case. This must be his point here. Lying by diplomacy. Diplomacy has no other mission. Every time a state wants to declare war upon another state, it starts off by launching a manifesto addressed not only to its own subjects, but also to the whole world. Notice that happens with the United States. In this manifesto, it declares that right and justice are on its side and endeavors to prove that it is actually by love of peace and humanity and democracy, and that imbued with generous and peaceful sentiments, it suffered for a long time in silence until mounting inquiry of its enemy forced it to bear its sword. At the same time, it vows that disdainfully of all material conquests and not seeking any increase into what we call territory, it will put an end to this war as soon as justice is reestablished, and its antagonists answer with a similar manifesto in which naturally right, justice, and humanity and all generous sentiments are to be found respectively on its side. These mutual opposed manifestos are written with the same eloquence. They breath the same righteous indignation. One is just as sincere as the other. That is to say, they are both brazen in their lives. And it is only fools who are deceived by them. Sensible persons, all those who have some political experience, do not even take the trouble of reading such manifestos. Now, I want to share something. What is occurring right now is similar to that, as the United States and Russia are doing their thing here, and you see the certain administrations here in the United States speaking such and such, and we hear the other side from Putin the other way. It's just the way they want you to be stirred up and to get involved in, to get you emotionally involved, and eventually to get you emotionally involved that you will actually sign up and fight a so-called enemy that is thousands and thousands of miles and is not even a threat to the United States at all, you see. And the whole idea of Ukraine itself as a country, and it is one of the largest countries by far in Europe, and is part of a strategic political foreign way of actually the United States has put what I would call Russia in a certain situation to just like similar to what we would call that happened in Cuba back in the 1960s, except it was completely different. It was the Soviet Union and the United States. So you have to understand that war talk all the time is being propagandized over and over and over, you see. And I don't care, both sides are, I don't choose sides here because neither side is right. That's where people get confused. They think one side is right and the other side's wrong. The reality simply is I don't want war. I opposed it. And I'm very much anti-war, period. Continue. President Wilson's statement just before he went to the Congress to request a constitutional declaration of war embodies every one of Bakunin's sentiments. He was lying by diplomacy, and he used the gross propaganda manufactured at Wellington House to inflame the American public by tales of atrocity committed by the German army in its march across Belgium in 1914. As we shall discover, it was for the most part a gigantic lie passed off as true. I remember looking through a large stack of old newspapers at the British Museum where I spent 5 years doing in-depth research. The papers covered the years of 1912 to 1920. I recall thinking at the time, isn't it amazing that the rush to the New World Order socialist totalitarian government should be led by the United States, supposedly a bastion of freedom? Then, as I recall, it came to me with a great clarity that the Committee of 300 has its people at the highest and lowest echelons embedded in the U.S. in banking, industry, trade, defense, the State Department, and indeed in the very White House, not to mention the elite club called the U.S. Senate, which in my opinion is a forum for pushing the New World Order. I recall thinking that President Wilson's propaganda blasts against Germany and the Kaiser, actually the product of Rothschild agent Lord Northcliffe and Rockmere, and the Wellington House propaganda factory, was not much different to the contrived situation of Pearl Harbor, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and looking back now, I can see no difference between the propaganda lies about the brutality of German soldiers allegedly chopping off the arms and legs of little Belgian children in 1914. You'll notice that when we went to the war with Iraq, it was always to deal with the children, folks. Remember that when George Bush did that. Same thing. Same thing. It gets people upset. Oh, it's children. Well, that's a different story. Yeah. Yeah. Same thing. Same propaganda. They do it to you over and over and over again. And you never learn. Then the methods used to get the American people duped and doped into following the Bush administration to invade Iraq. Yeah, sorry, I didn't see that. That's what, yes. Whereas in 1914, it was the Kaiser who was a brute savage, a ruthless murderer, and a monster, the butcher of Berlin. In 2002, it was President Hussein who was all of these things and a whole lot more, including the butcher of Baghdad. Poor duped, deluded, deceived, connived, trustful America. When will you ever learn? In 1917, the New World Order agenda was being rushed through the House and Senate by Woodrow Wilson, and President Bush forced the New World Order agenda for Iraq through the House and Senate in 2002. Without debate and exercising arbitrary power and gross violation of the U.S. Constitution, for which the American people are paying a huge price for. But the American people are suffering from toxic shock introduced by Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, and the American people are in a state of sleepwalking and without leadership. They do not know what the price is and do not care to find out. The Committee of 300 continues to rule the United States just as it did in the Wilson and Roosevelt presidents, while the American people were distracted with bread and circus. Only today is baseball, football, and endless Hollywood and Social Security. Nothing has changed. The United States, heralded, hounded, pushed, and shoved, and headed of a fast track to the New World Order, propelled along by the radical Republicans of the War Party, who have been taken over by the scientists of the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations. Just recently, I was asked by a subscriber, where do we find the Tavistock Institute? My response is look around the U.S. Senate, the House of Representatives, the White House, the State Department, the Defense Department, Wall Street, Fox News, and you will see their change agents in every one of their places. President Wilson was the first U.S. president to manage the war through a civilian community guided and directed by Bernays and Lepperman from Wellington House, to which we have already made mention. The resounding success of Wellington House and its enormous influence on the course of American history began before that in 1913. Of course it did. Wilson has spent almost a year tearing down the protective trade tariffs that had defended the American domestic markets from being overwhelmed by free trade. It's that whole thing. Remember that thing called free trade? You remember that? That stuff that's done during the Clinton administration, FTAA, and the NAFTA deal. Same crap, folks. Essentially a practice of allowing cheap British goods made with cheap labor in India to flood the American market. And on October 12, 1913, Wilson signed the bill that was the beginning of the end of the unique American middle class, long the target of favoring socialists. You know those socialists, guys. You know those guys that pretend to be as though they're in favor of helping the poor, but they use the poor. The bill was described as a measure to adjust tariffs, but it would have been accurate to describe it as a bill to destroy tariffs. They do this every time. They lie and lie and lie, and you people believe them every fucking time. Such was the hidden power of Wellington House that the vast majority of the American people accepted this lie, not knowing or realizing that it was a death knell for American commerce that would lead to NAFTA and GATT and the World Trade Organization. Even more astonishing was the acceptance of the federal income tax that was passed in September 5th, 1913. You see, they eliminated what we call the constitutional tariffs. That is, you had an import tax to protect industry, farmers, all this type of thing. And in reality, simply, they put it on the people's back. You see, as a source of revenue for the federal government, income tax is a Marxist doctrine not found in the U.S. Constitution any more than the Federal Reserve Bank is found in the Constitution. Wilson called his twin blows against the Constitution a fight for the people and for free business. I tell you what, he was some kind of character, wasn't he? And said he was proud to have taken part in the completion of a great piece of business. The Federal Reserve Act, explained by Wilson as reconstructed the nation's banking and currency system, was rushed through on a flood tide of propaganda, again emanating from Wellington House, just in time for the hostilities that began the horrors of World War I. Yes, that's the key. That is the whole key. That key is here. That key was simply there was no way of actually starting a war without the quote-unquote the Federal Reserve, which became nothing but a group of private bankers in order to create money, paper money, to buy and to lend to other countries such as Germany, Britain, France, and the United States in order for them to get in the war. Most historians agree with that without passing the Federal Reserve Bank Act, such as Lord Grey would not have been able to start that terrible confliction. The deceptive language of the Federal Reserve Act was under the guidance of Bernays and Lippmann, who set up the National Citizen League with the notorious Samuel Ottomeyer as its chairman to promote the Federal Reserve Bank that secured control of the people's money and currency and transfer it to a private monopoly without the victim's consent. One of the most interesting pieces of history surrounding the imposition of the foreign financial slavery measure was that when it was sent to Wilson for his signature, a copy was given to the Sinister Colonel Edward Mandell House as a representative of Wellington House in the British oligarchy, represented by the banker J.P. Morgan. In other words, that Mr. House had to approve it before it was actually even before Wilson even put his signature on it. That'll tell you who was actually running this country, folks. As to the American people in whose name the disastrous measure was instituted, they had not the faintest idea how they had been connived, cheated, lied to, and utterly deceived. An instrument of slavery was fastened around their necks without the victims ever becoming aware of it. Wellington House methodology was at its height when Wilson was coached in how to persuade Congress to declare war on Germany. Although he had won election on the solemn promise to keep America out of the war that was raging already in Europe, a great triumph for the new art of public opinion making. It was just that the poll questions were shaded in such a way that the answer reflected the opinions of the public, not their understanding of the questions, nor their understanding of the process of political science. Yes, correct. When you make questions up to ask people, they cannot be biased. They have to be extremely unbiased in order to be able to get a direct, clear answer. Unfortunately, that is not the way these agencies work. And I'm trying to think of what's called, a Gallup poll was the first. And Gallup, his last name, he benefited off this also, folks. They chose him for a reason, and he benefited. Very much so. A thorough search and reading of the congressional records from 1910 to 1920 by this writer showed very clearly that had Wilson not signed the ubiquitous currency reform bill on December 23rd, 1913, the upper-level parallel secret of government of the United States foretold by H.G. Wells would not have been able to commit the vast resources of the United States to the war in Europe. The House of Morgan represented the Olympians of the Committee of 300 in its all-powerful city of London financial nexus, playing a leading role in shaping the U.S. Federal Reserve banks, which were neither federal nor banks, but a private money-generating monopoly fastened around the necks of the American people, whose money was now free to be stolen on an unimaginable scale, making them slaves of the New World Order, insisting the coming one world government. See, this is all being done here, folks, piece by piece. It's like on a chessboard. And what they're doing, they've got this thing planned, maybe hundreds of years before. Maybe not that long. Let's go probably 30 years before. And so what they do, it's like chess. They're playing against another rival, such and such. And they make moves, such and such, and work in this way in order to get the so-called good guys on this side and the bad guys on this other side, so there can be war. So there can be an opponent. So what if you convince, supposedly you basically choose Britain, France, and America, but you got to find an antagonist also. You see, this is what people don't understand. You have to find someone else that opposes this or is the other side the same way. Without there cannot be a war. That's what they do. The Great Depression of the 1930s was the second major catastrophe bill the American people had to pay, first being World War I. Those who read this book at a first introduction to the New World Order inside of a one world government will be skeptical, but consider that no less a person than the great Sir Harold Mackinder, Mackinder, did not hide his beliefs about its comings. More than that, he gave notice that it might be a dictatorship. Sir Harold had an impressive resume, having been professor of geography at the University of London, director of London School of Economics from 1903 to 1908, and a member of the Parliament between 1910 and 1922. He was also a close associate of Arnold Toynbee, one of the leading lights of Wellington House. He had correctly predicted a core of startling geopolitical events, many of them actually coming to pass. One such prophecy was the founding of two Germanys, the Social Democratic Republic of Germany and the Federal Republic of Germany. Critics suggest that he got the information from Toynbee, that it was merely the long-range planning of the Committee of 300 that Toynbee knew about. So you see, they plan these things in advance, folks, years ahead. After Wellington House, Toynbee moved to the Royal Institute for International Affairs and to London University, where he held the chair for international history. In his book, America and World Revolution, he said, if we are to avoid mass suicide, we must have our world state quickly, and this probably means that we must have it in a non-democratic form to begin with. We will have to start building a world state now on the best design that is practical at the moment. Continued. Toynbee went on in the forthright manner, saying this world dictatorship would have to supplant the local national states which litter the present political map. This is over 100 years ago, folks. Over 100 years ago. The new world state was to be brought about on the basis of mass mind control and propaganda that would make it acceptable. I explained in my book, The Committee of 300, that Bernays blew the whistle on polling in his 1923 and 1928 books, one being Propaganda and the other one being Crystallizing Public Opinion. This was followed by engineering consent, self-preservation, ambition, pride, hunger, love of family and children, patriotism, and the desire to be a leader, love of play, these and other drives are the psychological raw materials which every leader must take into account to his endeavor to win the public to his point of view. To maintain their self-assurance, most people need to feel certain that whatever they believe about anything is true. These revealing works are examined, and we should add that in writing them, the Tavistock hierarchy apparently felt secure enough to gloat over their control of the United States and Great Britain that had blossomed into an open conspiracy along the lines first suggested by H.G. Wells. With the advent of Wellington House, funded by the British monarchy and later by Rockefeller, Rothschild, and the United States, Western civilization entered in the first phase of a plan that would provide a secret government to rule the world, namely the Committee of 300. Tavistock Institute of Human Relations was its creation. As this book is not about the Committee of 300, we will suggest that readers obtain copies of the first and second book, The Committee of 300. The 300's carefully structured blueprint has been followed to the letter, and today, as we reach the end of 2005, looking back, it's fairly easy for knowledgeable persons to trace the course that was laid out for Western civilization and to mark its progression to the point where we are today. This is a book that is an attempt to do just that. So let's see, here we go. So right here, that's the beginning part of it. Now we're going to continue on with chapter 1. That was the foreword. So the foreword is basically giving you an idea of what's going on, laying the foundation again as he continues to give his support and what he's explaining to what Tavistock is all about. So chapter 1 is the founding the world premier brainwashing institute. From its modest but vitally important beginning at Wellington House, the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations expanded rapidly to become the world's premier top secret brainwashing institute. How this rapid progression was accomplished needs to be explained. The modern science of mass manipulation of public opinion was born at Wellington House, that is in London, the lusty infant being midwife by Lord Northcliffe and Lord Rockmere. Again, it's also to do with the British monarchy, Lord Rothschild, and the Rockefellers. Now, some of you may not know who Lord Rothschild is, but Lord Rothschild is the one who's basically the controlling banker of all this. And in the book, I explained yesterday, the day before, I should say, with the whole book that deals with this is to do with Rothschild, the secrets of the Federal Reserve. You'll see the 5 arrows here are representing his 5 sons who eventually take over the banking houses in each country. And those countries would have been Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Austria at that time. And the Rockefellers were responsible for funding the venture. So they were getting money, okay? So the papers we were privileged to examine showed that the purpose of these at Wellington House was to effect a change in the opinion of the British people who were against the whole thing of war against Germany, a formal task that was accomplished by opinion makers through polling. The staff consisted of Arnold Toynbee, a future director of studies at the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Now, what he's talking about here is the Royal Institute of International Affairs. There is another group here that's similar to that. It's the Council of Foreign Relations. But the power, the CFR here, is actually a stepson below the Royal Institute of International Affairs. They take their orders from Britain, folks. Okay. Lord Northcliffe and the Americans, Walter Lippmann and Edward Bernays. Bernays was born in Vienna on November 22nd, 1891. And he is the nephew of Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis. See, this is all connected, folks, all connected with people. Regarded by many as the father of public relations, although the title properly belongs to Willy Munzenberg, Bernays pioneered the use of psychology and other social science to shape and form public opinion so that the public thought such manufactured opinions were their own. If we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, it is now possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without them knowing it, Bernays stated. He called this technique engineering consent. One of his best-known techniques of achieving this goal was the indirect use of what he called third-party authorities to shape the desired opinions. If we can influence the leaders, either with or without their conscious cooperation, you automatically influence the group which they sway. This technique is called opinion making. Perhaps we can now begin to understand how it was that Wilson, Roosevelt, Clinton, Bush the elder, and younger could so easily lead America into disastrous wars in which its people should never have been involved in. Correct. Joint British and American participants concentrated their efforts on techniques as yet not tried out to mobilize support for the war looming on the horizon. As previously stated, the British people did not want war and said so, but Toynbee, Lippmann, and Bernays expected to change that by applying techniques designed to manipulate public opinion through the use of polling. Herein, we provide a review of the methods that were devised and executed to bring Great Britain and the United States into the First World War, plus the techniques that were put into practice between the 2 world wars and beyond, as will be seen by propaganda was to play a major role. One of the main objectives at his Tavistock was to achieve the degradation of women. Tavistock recognized that Jesus Christ had brought a new place of respect in the order of civilization to womanhood, which prior to his coming had not been present. After Christ's ministry, womanhood gained a respect and high place in society absent from pre-Christian civilizations. Of course, it can be argued that such as elevated status existed in the Greek and the Roman empires, And it would be true to a certain extent, but not to the extent that womanhood would elevate it in post-Christ society. Tavistock sought to change that, and the process began immediately after World War I. The Eastern Orthodox Church, which is the Rus, R-U-S, Viking prince of Moscow, brought back from Constantinople reverend and respected womanhood, and their experience with the Khazarians, whom they subsequently defeated and drove out of Russia, left them determined to protect womanhood in Russia. The founding of the Romanov dynasty was Michael Romanov, was the scion of a noble family that had defended Russia on the basis of a Christian country. From 1613, the Romanovs sought to ennoble Russia and imbue it with great spirit of Christianity, which meant also protection for and the honoring of Russian womanhood. The princes of Moscow under Prince Dmitri Donsky, if I say that right, earned the unremitting hatred of the Rothschilds for Russia because of, and I'll spell it to you, of Donskoi, defeat and expulsion of the Khazarian herds that inhabit the lower regions of the Volga. This barbaric warrior nation of mysterious Indo-Turk origin had adopted the Judea religion on passage of a decree by King, I'll spell it Bulant, after the religion was approved by the chief Khazarian soothsayer, magical sorcerer David L, that is capital E, I'm sorry, EL-ROI. It was Elroy's personal flag, now called the Star of David, that became the official flag of the Khazarian nation when they settled in Poland after being forced out of Russia. The flag was also adopted by the Zionists as their standard and is still mistakenly called the Star of David. Christmas makes the error of confusing linking it with the Old Testament King David, when in fact there is no relation between the two. The hatred of Russia was compounded in 1612 when the Romanov dynasty led a Russian army against Poland, taking back large parts of Poland that had formerly belonged to Russia. The principal architect of enmity brought to bear against Russia was the Rothschild dynasty, and it was this burning hatred that Tavistock used and channeled in his plan to destroy Western civilization. The first opportunity created by Tavistock came in 1905 with the attack by the Japanese Navy that completely surprised the Russian fleet. The exercise was bankrolled by Jacob Schiff, that is S-C-H-I-F-F, the Wall Street banker who was related to Rothschilds. The defeat of the Russian fleet at Port Arthur in a surprise attack marked the beginning of the pale of gloom that was about to roll in over Christian Europe. The Rockefeller Standard Oil Group, directed by Tavistock, with the aid of the 300 engineered the Russian-Japanese War. That's correct, definitely. The money used to finance this operation came from Jacob Schiff, what was actually provided by Rockefeller's General Education Board, whose outward purpose was to finance Negro education. All the propaganda and advertising for the board was written and crafted by the social sciences, again at Tavistock, which was called simply Wellington House. And then we continue fast forward here as he explains it. In 1941, another Rockefeller Front organization, the Institute for Pacific Relations, simply called IPR, gave large sums to its Japanese counterpart in Tokyo. Are you well aware of all this, folks? This is amazing. I have read some information about Roosevelt in the 1930s. And the Rockefellers actually wanted to start a war with China in order to get their oil. That's true. Continue. The money was then funded to a member of the imperial family by a guy named Richard Sorge, S-O-R-G-E, a Russian master spy for the purpose of inducing Japan to attack the United States at Pearl Harbor. Again, Tavistock was the originator of all the IPR publications. Although it was not yet evident, as Spinnaker was to be mentioned in his monumental work published in 1936, it marked the beginning of the end of the old order. Contrary to most established accounts of history, the Russian Revolution was not a Russian Revolution at all, but a foreign ideology backed primarily by the Committee of 300 and its arm, the Tavistock Institute, that was violently forced upon its startling, unprepared, and dismayed Romanov family. It was political warfare, low-grade warfare and psychological warfare in which Tavistock had become well versed. As Winston Churchill was to remark, they transported Lenin in a sealed truck like a plaque basilicus from Switzerland into Russia, and then once established, Lenin and Trotsky seized Russia by the hair of its head. Yeah, the whole idea of master plan was that yes, Lenin was in Switzerland. He had already failed in his attempts to bring a revolution in earlier, and he was now thrown out of the country. He was living in Switzerland, and they made an agreement with Germany. They made an agreement with Germany. If you allow him in, passes through your rail line in a sealed compartment on a train, there will not be a front. There will not be an Eastern Front. You see. And of course, Germany went with that because simply now they would have to only fight one front instead of two. Much has been written, but nearly always in passing of it is a mere postcard to history about the sealed truck, sealed car, sealed train that transported Lenin and his Bolshevik revolution safely through the midst of war-torn Europe and deposit them in Russia, there to begin their imported Bolshevik revolution, so mistakenly termed the Russian Revolution. The documents the author was privileged to study at Wellington House, and what was revealed in Arnold Toynbee's papers and Bruce Lockhart's private papers led to the conclusion that without Toynbee, Bruce Lockhart, or MI6, British intelligence, and without the complicity of at least 5 European nations, ostensibly loyal and friendly with the court of St. Petersburg, the merciless Bolshevik revolution would have been stillborn. It wouldn't have worked. So they got other countries to help them out. And I think one of them is a Scandinavian country, and I think it's Finland, if I remember, because that's where Trotsky came from. He came from New York City and was on a ship. We'll continue. At this account, much of necessity be limited to Tavistock participation in the affair. It will not be as a complete account of the skullduggery we would like to have presented. According to Milner's private papers, his ace through Tavistock contacted a fellow socialist, Fritz Platten, Platten. Milner was a leading Fabian socialist, although he scorned Sidney and Beatrice Webb. Okay, that's when he speaks about Sidney and Beatrice Webb, they are important Fabian socialists. If you look at the CFR publication, International Foreign Affairs, there is a guy on a horse, and he's naked. And that is the Fabian Socialist symbol. If you don't know that, that would give you a clue of who actually is involved with Foreign Affairs, their magazine, their journal, I should say. And I read those in college, some of them. Okay. This was confirmed and borne out by Wilhelm Strauch's files, the majority of which were able to gain access to, which files were open to certain people qualified to read them. They tally fairly close with Bruce Lockhart's account in the private papers, as well as what Lord Alfred Milner had to say about the underhand affair that betrayed Russia. It appeared that Milner had many contacts among the Bolshevik expatriates, among them, that is, Lenin. It was to Lord Milner that Lenin went when he needed money for the revolution, armed with a letter of introduction from Platten, and Lenin met with Lord Milner and laid down his plan for the overthrow of the Romanovs and Christian Russia. Milner agreed on condition that he could send his agents, that is Bruce Lockhart of MI6, to supervise the day-to-day affairs and report back on Lenin. Lord Rothschild and the Rockefeller demanded that they be allowed to send Sidney Riley, R-E-I-L-L-Y, to Russia to supervise transfer of Russia's natural resources and the gold rubles held in the central bank to London. This was agreed to by Lenin and later Trotsky. To seal the bargain, Lord Milner, on behalf of the Rothschilds, gave Lenin £60 million in gold, sovereigns, while the Rockefellers contributed about $40 million. So they stalled their goal. Countries in complicity with the seal train affair were Great Britain, Germany, Finland, Switzerland, and Sweden. So if they hadn't got any of these countries to do this, whatever this was about, which would have been Finland's key, and also Sweden, because what happened, they had to go by train from Germany, and then Finland part was to do with Trotsky coming from New York City and coming on a ship. Switzerland is where he was at, and then Sweden was the area where Lenin would go into Sweden and eventually to St. Petersburg. While the United States was not directly involved, it must have been aware of what was going on. After all, on the orders of President Wilson, a brand new American passport was issued to Leon Trotsky, whose real name was Lev, L-E-V, Bronstein, so that he could travel in peace, although Trotsky was not a U.S. citizen. Lenin and his compatriots were provided with private, well-appointed rail carriers by the top German government functionaries and always kept locked by agreements with stations along the line. Platten was in charge, and he laid down the rules for the trip, some of which are listed in Wilhelm Strauss's files. The carriage was to remain locked for the entire trip. No one could board the carriage without Platten's permission. The train would have extraterritorial status. No passports were to ask at the borders. Tickets would be bought at regular prices. No security issues to be raised by the military or police of any country en route. According to Wilhelmstrasse files, the trip was authorized and approved by General Ludendorff and Kaiser Wilhelm. Ludendorff went so far as to say that if the Sweden refused to let the Bolsheviks pass, he would guarantee them passage in Russia through the German lines. As in other words, it would go through their military lines, or maybe it's to do with the train lines. I don't know. We'll have to figure that one out. Anyway, go on. As it turned out, the Swedish government raised no objection, and neither did the Finnish government. So neither one of them had any objections to it. One of the noble revolutionaries who joined the train when it arrived at the German frontier with Switzerland was Radek, R-A-D-E-K, yes, who was to play a leading role in the bloody Bolshevik revolution. There were some lighter moments too. Wilhelmstrasse files describe how the carriage missed its engine at Frankfurt, resulting in it being shut to and from for about 8 hours. So someone screwed up. The party had to detrain in the German Baltic town of Sassnitz, where they were accorded decent accommodations by the German government. The Swedish government kindly gave them ferry transport to Malmö, from where they sailed to Stockholm, where nice accommodation awaited the Bolshevik party for overnight layover, and then it was on to the Finnish border. There, the intrepid Platten left the high-spirited party, and the final journey into Russia was made by train to Petrograd. I'm sorry I said St. Petersburg, but anyway, this epic journey that began in Zurich, Switzerland, ended in Petrograd. Lenin had arrived on the scene, and Russia was about to be brought low. And throughout, Bernays and Lieberman and their associates at Wellington House, that is Tavistock, kept up a steady flow of brainwashing propaganda that it was safe to dupe much of the world. So that's the conclusion of chapter 1 tonight. Probably not going to do, I don't think I'm going to do any more tonight, but I just thought I'd share this with you tonight. Again, this is vitally important for you to understand that these things don't happen by accident, and how, in fact, there was only one particular newspaper that even reported on the threat when the Lusitania took place. It was one newspaper, and actually it was in Des Moines, Iowa, I think it was, that the Germans tried to warn the passengers not to get onto the Lusitanian ship, that it might be actually attacked. And no one knew. No one told them. All the New York papers didn't say that. They didn't share any of that information at all, whatsoever. Now, you have to understand how that is over 100 years ago, and the media was bought and paid for back then. What do you think it is now? What do you think it is now, folks? Think about it. And the interesting part is, like, most of you are not aware, the Russians actually had a war before the First World War with Finland. They were trying to take their land, and Finland fought valiantly against the overwhelming forces of the Russians, and basically it became a draw. Okay, so you've got to ask yourself, hey, what is going on? Why does this happen? Well, most of these leaders are bought and paid for. When they're told to do certain things, they don't say no. They do what they're told to do. You see, there's a pecking order, and if you're in that position, such and such, you're going to be pecked, and you were in that office for a reason. Well, the reason why is because simply you were bought and paid for. So you can't say no. You see, that's what people don't understand. The politicians are actually bought and paid for. So if they choose to not do it, they won't be living, folks, pretty much. So they go along with it because someone else gets them in office. So that'll be the conclusion of chapter 1 of the Tavistock Institute tonight. And it's a brilliant book by Mr. Coleman. And I hope that you guys can be involved again with this video, because I'll continue to share this book, and I'm continuing to do the Secrets of the Federal Reserve also. And I may do that tonight. We'll see how I feel a little later. But thank you for listening. Thank you for being a part of this. And again, if you have questions, you're more than welcome to ask questions. I don't see any here right now being posted here on StreamYard, what actually is YouTube, but it should be on Facebook. So anyway, if you do have even questions afterwards, I'll try to answer those as best I can. So my saying here is that something's possible even when you think about what's taking place in Ukraine. It's a lot to do with this. I'm trying to think of his name right now, and I can't think of the name. He's now dead. Zabrensky. Zabrensky wrote some books, and those books were simply based upon his idea of the United States threatening Russia to have arms on Poland, on the Eastern European side, and actually have arms also in Ukraine and Czechoslovakia and Poland. Poland and Czechoslovakia for sure. And you'll notice that what is going on is a hyping up of the war, because we now have troops actually on the ground, what I understand, in Ukraine, which is stupid as hell. Okay, it is. It's stupid. And what's taking place simply right now is that we're not involved, although we're giving them almost all of our military surplus. People are unaware of what's going on here, folks. That these arms are actually for us to defend ourselves, and it's being shipped over to Ukraine. And who knows who's getting these arms, who's getting these military weapons or whatever. And they're sophisticated weapons. And this is asinine. This is very much asinine what's going on. It's fucking stupid. But the key is simply this is what they do. But I don't want war. I don't want war with anybody. And again, it's not a threat here in the United States. You see, there's no one coming to our front door here and in the ocean attacking us, or even in the air, so to speak. And yet we're involved in other countries such and such, especially Ukraine. Ukraine's a major deal, folks. It is a major deal because it's one of the largest countries, but it's not a member of NATO. It's not been approved. It's not a member of NATO. And so why is this country sending its hardware, military hardware, as other NATO countries are doing, like Italy, like Great Britain, like Germany? So something else is going on here. So, but anyway, I appreciate you being here, and thank you. You have a good night. Take care.